Paris, March 1944. The 109 was 30 feet off the Seine, and it was pulling away. 600 yards. The gap wasn't closing, it was growing. If a bandit dives for the deck over the city, you break off. That's a direct order. One pilot over Paris alone is not a kill, it's a loss. Had heard those words at briefing. He was hearing them now. The German pilot had made his decision somewhere over the northern suburbs, rolled the nose down, gone for the rooftops. Standard move against a pursuer with options. Below, stone bridges, power lines, anti-aircraft positions on the rooftops, the river cutting through the city like a gray scar. Every obstacle was a reason to break off. The doctrine said break off. The doctrine had been written for exactly this situation. Stayed with him. The numbers existed, even if no briefing had put them in a single sentence. The P-51B at the deck, 390 miles per hour. The 109 G6 at the deck, 340. 50 miles per hour of separation. The question was which direction that gap ran. At altitude, the German pilot held the edge. Down here, at 30 feet over the Seine, the equation was different. The German pilot did not know that yet. He dove because diving had worked before. Against P-47s, against early Mustangs, against everything that flew over occupied France before the autumn of 1943. He dove because the city below him was his shield, and a lone American would not be reckless enough to follow. The tower was to the right. The river threw back two reflections, one chasing the other. The German pilot chose low altitude to escape. One question, why that choice killed him instead. At this altitude, had no minutes. He had seconds. Every second he gave away was another 50 yards of distance. Another 50 yards between his gun sight and that tail. The throttle was still in his hand. March 1944. The 357th Fighter Group had been operational for 11 weeks. 11 weeks long enough to bury the first pilots, short enough that the 363rd Fighter Squadron still flew with empty slots in formation nobody had filled. The 8th Air Force had a doctrine, and the doctrine existed because the 8th Air Force had been losing aircraft at rates that could not be sustained. Bombing missions into occupied France, fighter escort peeling off at the edge of their range, bombers continuing alone into the flak corridors. The solution had been the P-51. The solution had come with instructions. Escort the bombers. Hold formation. If a Luftwaffe fighter takes a shot and dives for the deck, do not follow him into the city. Do not pursue a single bandit over occupied territory at rooftop level. The math was unambiguous. A P-51 lost over Paris was a P-51 lost. A 109 that escaped was still one 109. Trade was not in the 8th Air Force's favor. The logic was sound for the aircraft they'd been flying until 6 months ago. Had 3 options over the Seine. He ran through them the way any pilot would, not consciously, not as a checklist, but as a body of knowledge that lived in his hands and his throttle arm. Option 1, climb, gain altitude advantage, come down on the 109 from above. Standard bounce doctrine. He knew it the way he knew his own heartbeat. 600 yards, 650. The German pilot had gone down before, could position for it. Altitude advantage required altitude. The 109 was 30 feet off the river and accelerating. By the time climbed to bounce height, the German would be a dot over the left bank. 700 yards. The numbers moved in one direction only. Option 2, break left, use the city grid to cut the angle, regain visual contact from a parallel street. Lose him for 10 seconds, pick him up again 2 blocks over. The density of Paris from the air is not a map. It is a surface. Stone blocks and zinc rooftops fused into something solid and irregular, with no clear lanes, no geometry that held from moving angles, no way to predict where a low-flying aircraft would be in 12 seconds. Over open country, you could calculate the intercept. Over Paris at 30 feet, you were guessing. That's exactly what the commander had meant. Exactly this. The doctrine had been written in a room with maps and performance charts. It was correct. Every word of it was correct. And still. Option 3, hold altitude. Wait. The German would climb eventually, fuel, navigation, the simple geometry of needing to cross the Seine somewhere above bridge height. When he came back up, would have position. But the 109 wasn't climbing. Every second it stayed down, it added another 50 yards of separation. Not 100 yards, not close enough for a deflection shot. In 30 seconds, the gap would be beyond effective range. In 60 seconds, the German would be over the suburbs and gone. The pilot who didn't come home last week had been from the 363rd. His name was in the roster. His slot in formation was still listed, still assigned, because paperwork moved slower than men died. He was from Virginia, southern part of the state, different from country. The kind of difference that matters when you're talking about tobacco farms versus the Piedmont. But the kind that collapses entirely when you're standing in an English hangar in February smelling hydraulic fluid and cigarette smoke, and the particular cold that comes off a P-51 that's been sitting on the flight line since before dawn. He had talked about his father's farm, the spring planting. He had a specific way of saying the word yield that made it clear he was talking about something that still existed in the future, something with a date attached, a season that would arrive, a thing that would happen. Remembered the smell of the hangar that morning. The way the sound was different when one of the slots was empty. Not quieter, just shaped differently, like a room where a chair has been moved and you notice before you see where. That German would get away, like others had. If broke off now, the man climbed to altitude somewhere over the and landed in time for dinner. The engagement ended. The paperwork listed it as one contact, no confirmation. Had 20 seconds to make the decision he'd already made. The commander's words from the mission briefing were exact. He could hear the exact register, the pause before direct order. If a bandit dives for the deck over the city, you break off. That's a direct order. One pilot over Paris alone is not a kill, it's a loss. The room had been quiet. What the commander's briefing had not included, because no briefing included it, because it was not yet doctrine, because the piece of paper that would eventually say it in clear terms didn't exist yet in March 1944, was the V-1653's behavior below 500 feet. Two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Not the single-stage system in the powered early Mustangs, not the single stage in the P-47, not anything the 109G's DB-605 pilot had ever faced at deck level. The V-1653 maintained boost pressure across altitude ranges where the DB-605 began bleeding it away. The engineering was not secret. It was simply not tactical knowledge yet. It lived in maintenance manuals, in the hands of crew chiefs, in the data sheets the North American aviation engineers had filed, and the RAF had tested, and nobody had yet translated into the sentence. Below 500 feet, the P-51B accelerates away from the 109G. Knew his engine, not from a briefing, from the hours. The German pilot chose the deck because it had always worked before, because the city was a maze and pursuers were human, because every calculation in his experience said, go low, go fast, lose them over the rooftops. Every calculation except one. The 109 dropped to 400 feet over the northern bank, then 300. The Seine appeared below it like a road. Watch the gap, 750 yards. The German was not climbing back up. He was committed to the deck, committed to the city, committed to the geometry that had saved German pilots before him. His tail disappeared between two buildings for a second and reappeared over the water lower now, using the river as a corridor. 750 yards was outside effective gun range for a deflection shot. At this closure rate, it was getting worse, not better. His left hand moved. Not a decision, a movement. The throttle forward. The Merlin's pitch changed, not dramatically, not like a film, but in the specific way that a 12-cylinder engine with a two-stage supercharger responds when the boost comes in clean and full at low altitude. The nose dropped. The Seine came up toward the windscreen. 500 feet, he was following. 300 feet. The left bank was a gray-brown wall to his right, windows and zinc rooftops moving past faster than he could track them individually. Below, the river. Ahead, the 109, smaller than he wanted it to be, its tail flicking left as it adjusted course around the La Site. He had crossed the line from a decision he could reverse to a situation he had to complete. There was no altitude to use. There was no formation to return to. There was the throttle position and the gun sight and the distance between them. He went lower. The first bridge went past on his right, close enough that he could see the stone arch without looking for it. The second bridge was ahead. The German pilot banked around it and was over open water again, the tower rising in peripheral vision to the right and above, the only vertical reference in a world that had gone flat. 390 miles per hour, distance 700 yards. The V-1653 at deck level was not the same engine it was at altitude. This was the engineering fact that no briefing had delivered as a tactical sentence. The two-stage supercharger maintained manifold pressure in the regime, where the DB-605 single-stage system had already begun to lose it. Not suddenly, progressively. Every 100 feet of altitude surrendered cost the German engine something it could not get back down here. The P-51B was accelerating. The 109G was not. 395 miles per hour, distance 500 yards. The German pilot added throttle, could see it in the way the exhaust changed at the 109's cowling, the slight increase in trail. The DB-605 responded with what it had, which was less than it had been 30 seconds ago. 500 yards. The distance had moved the wrong direction for the German. 400 miles per hour, 450 yards. The tower was behind now, in his mirrors gone. Paris from 100 feet was not a city. It was a sequence of problems: bridge approach, bank angle, power line clearance, obstacle identification. There was no map. There was only the next 800 yards of river corridor and the gray shape of the 109 beginning to resolve into something with features: tail configuration, wingspan, the specific geometry of a German fighter seen from behind at shrinking distance. 405 miles per hour, distance 350 yards. The German pilot made a correction: a left bank, steeper than necessary, trying to change the angle of the chase, put a bridge support between himself and the P-51. Standard thinking. Put an obstacle in the pursuer's path and the pursuer breaks off. The pursuer did not break off. 350 yards. The 109 came back wings level. The pilot had run the calculation and found no solution in it. 410 miles per hour. Distance 250 yards. Altitude under 100 feet. 4.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in the wings of the P-51B, effective range for a stern shot at this aspect. 300 yards and closing. His thumb was on the trigger button. His right hand kept the stick steady against the ground effect turbulence coming off the river surface. Two things happening in the same body simultaneously: the aim and the flight. 250 yards. 415 miles per hour. Distance 150 yards. He could see the rudder trim tab. The fuel gauge was a fact he'd been aware of for 4 minutes without looking directly at it. He looked at it now. One pass. The math on fuel state versus base distance gave him one firing pass over Paris. If he expended his position without hitting, if the 109 jinked at the wrong moment, if his deflection calculation was off, if the German pilot had one more move that hadn't modeled, there was no second attempt. There was the return flight, which was already at the edge of the margin. One pass, one position. If he missed, went home without a kill and without enough reserve to declare the fuel state comfortable. He was alone. The rest of the 363rd was somewhere over the northern suburbs, inbound to rejoin the bombers. Radio contact had been intermittent since he dropped below the building line. Nobody knew where he was. If a German anti-aircraft position on a rooftop opened up right now, and there were anti-aircraft positions on rooftops along the Seine, he knew this. Everyone knew this. A single burst would end the engagement without having fired a round. He held his position. Then the DB-605 told the truth. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way that ends with smoke and a fireball. In the precise, measurable way of an engine that has been operating below its critical supercharger altitude for 90 seconds and has been progressively losing the pressure it needs to make the power its pilot is demanding. The 109's speed stopped increasing, not decreasing, simply not increasing. The German pilot had pushed his throttle to whatever position would give him maximum output, and maximum output at this altitude, through this engine, on this day, was a number that was smaller than the number behind him. The gap closed to 100 yards. Fired. The German pilot had executed the correct maneuver. Low altitude, city terrain, river corridor, this combination had broken off Allied pursuit on 3 documented occasions in the months prior. The P-47 did not follow into Paris. The early P-51A did not follow into Paris. When an Allied fighter dropped down to the deck over a major occupied city, it was generally because it was damaged and descending, not because it was attacking. The doctrine that produced this behavior was not timidity. It was the survival mathematics of operating in hostile airspace without friendly anti-aircraft coverage, without rescue options, without wingmen. The German pilot had flown his training correctly. He had gone where his training told him pursuers did not go. He heard the American engine behind him and did not understand why it wasn't falling back. Below 500 feet, German aviation doctrine was clear. Engine performance curves favored the defender who knew the terrain. The DB-605 was a proven combat, rated correctly, maintained correctly, operating within its parameters. He did not know his parameters, and the parameters of the aircraft behind him had separated at the altitude he'd chosen. He knew the Merlin was behind him. He did not know which Merlin. He did not know the difference between the single stage in the early Mustang and the built two-stage variant that had replaced it in the B model. Nobody had told him because nobody on his side had encountered it at deck level over a major city at full throttle long enough to file a report. He made one more correction. Left bank. Hard. The river curved south and he followed it, trying to put between the P-51 and himself. The P-51 came around the bank faster than he did. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds from the point crossed below 500 feet to the point. The 109 went into the river. Pulled up. Paris came back into its normal orientation horizontal below him, with streets and blocks and the specific gray color of the city on a March morning. He climbed back through 1,000 feet. The Merlin ran clean. The fuel gauge read what it read. He set course for the base in England. The report he would write that evening listed the engagement accurately. Time, location, aircraft type, rounds expended, confirmation. It also listed the deviation from assigned mission single pursuit, unsanctioned, over occupied urban territory, in violation of standing orders. The intelligence officer read it, set it down. Was ordered to explain the departure from doctrine in writing. The victory was confirmed. The report was filed. Both things were true at the same time in the same folder in the same office. Flew 96 combat missions over Europe. 96 times the Merlin ran beside his left ear at full power, inside a cockpit without pressurization, without insulation worth naming, without the noise attenuation that later generations of pilots would consider standard. The P-51B cockpit at 390 miles per hour produces a sustained noise load that flight surgeons in 1944 had not yet learned to measure or prevent. They measured it later. Post-war audiological evaluations of 8th Air Force P-51 veterans showed progressive high-frequency hearing loss in the left ear, the engine side, at rates above the general population. Tinnitus, permanent, bilateral, onset typically within 5 years of separation from service. Came home from the war, and the sound came with him. He did not describe what triggered it. He described it by what he avoided. Low bridges. Certain light on water, the flat gray of a river on a cold morning, seen from above at speed. He flew commercially after the war, as passengers do in seats, looking at altitude from the passenger side of the window. The light off a river seen from 5,000 feet in a commercial aircraft is a different thing than the light off the Seine at 50 feet. Not different enough, on certain mornings, to prevent the body from running a calculation it no longer needed to run. He didn't talk about Paris for decades. Not because there was shame in it, because the explanation required a listener who understood what a two-stage supercharger did at deck level, and what the difference was between a DB-605 and a V-1653, and why that difference mattered at 50 feet over a French river in March, and why a man would follow an enemy fighter into those conditions alone. That explanation, delivered in a living room in Virginia in 1952 or 1963 or 1971, ran long. Most of the people who would have understood it were either dead or not talking either. The Distinguished Flying Cross citation described his service in aggregate. It used the phrase outstanding aerial combat missions. It did not name Paris. It did not name the Seine. The photograph P-51B below the tower, river visible, the German fighter somewhere ahead of the frame, circulated in aviation history books without a caption that included his name, until researchers found it decades later. The pilot from the 363rd with the tobacco farm in Virginia never planted his spring crop. His slot in the formation roster stayed listed for 11 days before the paperwork caught up. Flew home in 1945. There was one of them. The 8th Air Force Tactical Bulletins of 1944 and 1945 documented a principle that had existed in the engineering data since the P-51B entered service. The V-1653's two-stage supercharger maintained usable boost pressure below 5,000 feet at levels the 109G's DB-605 could not match. In low-altitude pursuit below the German engine's critical supercharger altitude, the P-51B held a speed advantage of approximately 50 miles per hour. The pilot who drove a 109 to the deck was not escaping. He was entering the 1 altitude band where the aircraft behind him was faster. This was not secret. It was simply not tactical knowledge until pilots came back from engagements and wrote reports that described what had happened. The RAF Air Fighting Development Unit had reached the same conclusion through comparative testing. AFDU evaluation records from 1944 documented the DB-605's power degradation below 5,000 feet against the Merlin 66 series and the built equivalent. The numbers were unambiguous. German pilots applying the low-altitude escape maneuver against P-51 after autumn 1943 were applying a tactic that had been correct against every Allied fighter they had previously faced. Against the engine P-51A, going low worked. Against the P-47 Thunderbolt, going low worked. The Thunderbolt's R-2800 radial was optimized for mid-altitude performance and penalized by its own weight and drag at the deck. Against the P-51B with the two-stage Merlin, going low was a different calculation. Most German pilots did not live long enough to file an updated assessment. The tactical principle that had applied by instinct over Paris, drive the enemy into the altitude band where his engine underperforms, entered American fighter doctrine explicitly in the training cycles of 1944 and 1945. P-51 pilots were briefed on the supercharger advantage at low altitude. Pursuit below 5,000 feet was reframed from a dangerous deviation into a specific tactical option against the 109 and 190 variants that dominated German fighter operations. In Korea, the question came back in a different form. The F-86 Sabre against the MiG-15, two swept-wing aircraft with different engine performance curves across the altitude envelope. 4th Fighter Interceptor wing pilots discovered empirically, as had discovered empirically, that the MiG-15's advantage was altitude-dependent, that forcing the engagement outside the MiG's optimal band changed the outcome. The debrief structure, the after-action language, the institutional process for translating individual pilot knowledge into distributed tactical doctrine, all of it descended directly from the system the 8th Air Force had developed by 1945. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, established at Miramar in 1969, known informally as Top Gun, built its curriculum on a concept its instructors called envelope fighting, identifying the altitude, speed, and energy state where your aircraft outperforms the adversaries, and maneuvering to force the engagement into that band. The language was new. The principle was the one had demonstrated over the Seine in March 1944, with a throttle push and 750 yards of river to close. F-16 pilots today study adversary engine performance curves as part of pre-mission analysis. The question is always the same: where is their window, and how do you get them outside it? The photograph of P-51B serial 436819 beneath the tower appeared in aviation history volumes for years without a confirmed caption. Researchers working from 357th Fighter Group records eventually identified the aircraft and the pilot. The image, river visible, tower above, the angle suggesting very low altitude and high speed, became one of the most reproduced photographs from 8th Air Force operations over occupied Europe. It appears in museum installations. It appears in documentary footage. It appears in the opening sequences of productions about the air war over France. William Jr.'s Distinguished Flying Cross citation does not mention Paris. It does not mention the Seine. It does not mention the tower, the 109G, or the specific engagement of March 1944. It uses language about sustained aerial combat service over the European theater, language applied to hundreds of citations issued during the same period, language that recorded the aggregate without recording the particular. Lived in Virginia until 2013. He was 92 years old. In his later years, he gave interviews. He described the engagement accurately and without embellishment, the throttle position, the altitude, the way the gap closed, the fuel state on the return flight. He did not describe it as historic. He described it as what had happened. The German pilot chose an altitude below 500 feet because at that altitude, every aircraft he had previously encountered lost power before he did. In March 1944, his DB-605 produced fewer horsepower at that altitude than the engine mounted in the aircraft behind him. The gap between them closed at approximately 50 miles per hour. He did not return.